What if we take that philanthropy and rather than give it away, invest it in entrepreneurs? You don't just use your heart, but you use your head.
You don't want to create dependency. You want to set these people free.
That's not charity. That's market building.
We kept on trying to solve that problem in a top-down fashion, and it just didn't work. And you came up with a completely different way to not only empower the people, but to actually get it to work.
We don't really get dignity until everyone has dignity. Investment is a means to fully outsized impact to help us solve our most pressing human problems. I don't think there's a better return on your dollar.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I cannot tell you how excited I am to have today's guest, Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder of the Acumen Fund, in which I have been active and will be active again, best-selling author of The Blue Sweater, which is a lovely book, by the way, and your newer book, The Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. I don't think that there's an accolade that you haven't earned. You're among the top 100 thinkers, according to Foreign Policy magazine, the 25 smartest people of the decade, says the Daily Beast, 100 greatest living business minds, according to Forbes. My gosh, Jacqueline, how do you even how do you accomplish all of this? First off, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And I don't even know how to answer that. I surround myself with people who are so much better at what they do than I could ever do, Jim. And I'm a good cheerleader. I think it comes with the territory of being the eldest of 7.
So I'm the youngest of 6, but I couldn't agree with you more. It's like everyone will say sometimes to me, wow, I can't believe how you managed to do this, and this. And I'm like, oh, no. I'm the show horse part. The workhorses on my team are the ones who actually do all the real work. So we're very, very lucky in sharing that point of view in that regard. You know, what drew me to Acumen and you originally was you have a completely different model for charitable giving. Your approach is all around. Listen, poverty isn't just an income thing. Poverty is a lack of dignity. It is a lack of options and choices. And I found your view with the Acumen Fund so refreshing. So if you don't mind, let's start there. And for our listeners who don't know the origins of the Acumen Fund, could you sort of take us through that origin story? And then we'll talk a little bit about how you approach giving in a vastly different, and I think far more effective manner than many of the other international charities.
Thanks. Sure. So the origin story really goes back to probably like you, as the youngest of 6, eldest of 7, growing up in a big Catholic family with this idea of to whom much is given, much is expected. So always having this desire to know the world and, frankly, to contribute to the world. And yet, the economic realities of having to make my way through the world. And so my first job was on Wall Street. I found I loved the tools of banking. My first job brought me to 40 countries as well. And that was my first interaction with the then so-called developing world. And I remember going to Brazil, falling madly in love, and yet seeing how that the bank's loans were never given to the people who I saw actually doing the work in the streets, the ones who were in the favelas, who were so full of work and life and desire, and yet they didn't even have the confidence to walk into the doors of the bank because they knew they wouldn't be served. That was a huge experience in my young professional life that sent me on this journey to try and understand what it would take to actually use the tools of business and banking and extend them to people who'd never had access to credit. I'd heard about the Grameen Bank, which was developed in 1976 and gave tiny loans to women. very effectively. And I thought maybe I could do something like that too. Long story lands me in Rwanda, where I ended up starting the first microfinance bank in that country with 5 Rwandan women, and saw how you could change a corner of the world with enough determination and a few skills, given who I was, how young I was. But I also saw, to your point, Jim, that this was an era of a lot of top-down aid, charity, government assistance that was creating dependency, which is the opposite of dignity. And the culmination of all of that was this inequality, and ultimately, this is a country that went through the genocide. That the knowing, working with, and loving people and building an institution for social justice, who then experienced a genocide and in some cases helped lead the genocide, made me really think about what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to actually operationalize, not just getting people a little more income or a job for a job's sake, but actually the dignity of having choice and opportunity. That's when Acumen was born in 2001. We started with this idea that if people had choice and were treated like customers and not passive recipients of charity, we might actually do a better job getting goods and services to them that they otherwise wouldn't have. Second, we saw capital as ecumenical. The irony is that philanthropy should be the most risk-oriented capital that we have, and yet it's where we too often see people not taking risk. And so we asked ourselves, what if we take that philanthropy and rather than give it away, invest it in entrepreneurs who are trying to build markets where they have not existed and solve problems of poverty in health, in education, in energy, in agriculture. At the time, we thought patient capital was 7 to 10 years. I've since learned that disrupting entire industries or building new ones altogether can take 10 to 20 years. And so you have to be really patient with your capital and support those entrepreneurs and those companies with management assistance, your social capital, your access to networks. And if you do that and you're diligent, and to your point, you don't just use your heart, but you use your head, and you're willing to call failure and take write-offs, this can work. And our companies today have brought services and goods to over 500 million people. I see companies, for $1 of philanthropy we invest, not only do you see $65 in impact created for an individual or a family, but you see self-sustaining businesses that are then in the long term contributing jobs and real opportunities to the economy. And so that's the Acumen model.
And that was precisely what drew me to you and to the fund. I loved the way you reoriented it and treated it as an investment, and an investment specifically in people. I was so incredibly aligned with you on the terms of you don't want to create dependency. You want to set these people free. You don't want to just like dump a bunch of stuff on them. And the number of times I've told the story of the woman's company making the mosquito netting that I'm going to ask you to tell, and the microfinance, but also the ambulance company in India. And I would literally, having these conversations, I would use venture terms. I would say, I don't know a hedge fund. I don't know a VC fund that's getting like a 65x return on their investments. And that's what you were doing. Like you are, you're at Thorpe if you're just doing it for money. And so share the two stories, because I love the mosquito net story because we kept on trying to solve that problem in a top-down fashion, and it just didn't work. And you came up with a completely different way to not only empower the people, but to actually get it to work.
You say so many interesting things, and I feel like you're in my head, which is amazing about you. But I literally wrote this morning that Acumen's theory of change starts with people. And we've actually grown from the model I just talked to you about to one where we have an academy that teaches young entrepreneurial leaders operational financial skills and what we call the moral imagination. From that, we hope that some of those entrepreneurs will go and get invested in with our patient capital. And then we've got about 300 million that we're managing in the for-profit space. And then it's take the insights, take the lessons, and share it with the world. You're bringing me back to one of the earliest investments at Acumen in bed nets. At the time, this is back in the early 2000s, 95% of all malaria was in Africa, and 95% of all bed net production was in Asia. And so Sumitomo had developed a polyethylene-based fiber that could be injected with an organic insecticide, pyrethrum, that had a very high efficacy rate. And but they didn't know whether they could manufacture it on the African continent, and there was very little belief that this could be done with efficiency. And so this was actually a collaboration where Acumen helped find the right entrepreneur. So we didn't do it. And then we helped build a partnership with UNICEF, we needed resin from Exxon, from the polyethylene, the production of oil. And so Exxon actually contributed this resin that would hold the pyrethrum. And before you knew it, there was one line of malaria bed nets. And every time I would go back, there would be more. And the company grew till they had about between 10 and 13,000 employees. And they were making 30 million bed nets a year. And this is now almost 20 years. So it's been more than 500 million bed nets manufactured out of Arusha, Tanzania. And the whole time that we were part of it, and we exited long, long ago, but the whole time we were part of it, I would talk to Anusha and Binesh, who were the founders, and I would say, I'm such a believer in African solutions to African problems. This is still an import, but this is a third generation family that is creating now one of the largest companies in the country, providing good jobs and life-changing technologies. And just a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, Binesh called me and he said, Jacqueline, we've just developed the first new anti-resistant malaria bed net here in our laboratory in Arusha. And so that original patience allowed the fundamentals to create a foundation in Tanzania, which now is creating an African solution to an African problem. And I think this is the story, and it's why you started at People. It is an investing and a venture approach, but it's also a relationship approach. It's a long-term commitment to the people and to the planet, and to seeing investment as a means to solve a problem and not simply as an end in and of itself.
There's just, you're inside my head too, because one of the things that we do at O'Shaughnessy Ventures is give fellowships and grants. And the idea of African solutions for African people. We have a fellow actually who is in Africa. And the reason he got the fellowship, you were probably whispering in my ear and I didn't even know it, because he had come up with an on-the-ground solution for sanitary napkins for African women. I knew nothing about the problem. All of the sanitary napkins and other devices were imported. They were very, very expensive. And so what was happening was young women, young ladies were going without. And this gentleman formed a mostly female company in which they were going to use banana fiber to create them on the ground in Africa. and he's just killing it. And he and the women running that firm are making huge differences locally. And I love your idea because I was chatting with him at an offsite, and he's got big plans. He wants it to be in Pan Africa. He wants it, but the idea is he saw the problem. He thought like an entrepreneur. He thought, no, I don't want any of this from outside. I want to create opportunities here. I want to solve the problems here. And that is such a great lesson that I think I must have learned from you when listening to Acumen's strategies.
Thank you for saying that. Because, Jim, there's such a hunger also of young entrepreneurial leaders. Just in West Africa, we got over 700 applications for the 20 spots this year. And these young people are doing incredible things in a way that 20 years ago, we didn't see that pipeline that we have today. I was just in Nigeria a while ago, and there's a company called Coolbox. And this is a solar refrigeration and freezer company, which just got a contract after really disrupting the market, just got a contract for the first assembly of the refrigeration in Lagos. So for me, it's been really fun over these past 20 years to see a new generation come to teach us what we did not know.
I certainly got the Africa bug. And when we were in Nairobi, we were talking to lots of people in one of the larger slums there. And I honestly was just so impressed by the energy, the enthusiasm, the incredible amount of ideas that these people had. And I just think Africa is just, it's blue sky, in my opinion. If they can, their population is young, they're tech savvy. We have invested in several feeder funds that are on the ground in Africa because, like, I just think there's so much potential there. How do you answer, like, the naysayers? You're probably much better at this than I am. It was like, yeah, but all of the political risk, all of the existential risk. You yourself mentioned, Rwanda and the horrors that happened there. What do you say to the people who are always like going on and on about how, yeah, great opportunity, but also huge, huge risks?
Well, all great opportunity comes with risk, first of all. Number two, to your point, Jim, this is the youngest population on the planet. It's upwardly mobile, very ambitious, wants to be connected, and full of opportunity. And if you're going to talk about Kenya, I actually think Kenya could be the first African tiger, because Kenya also is more than 85% electrified. Most of that electricity is coming from geothermal, hydro, green sources. So Kenya will soon be a low-cost hub, not only for distribution, but for manufacturing. Very educated, very entrepreneurial youth. And so, one, I look at just the macro situation of what that looks like compared to aging America, aging Europe, who's also increasingly full of too much cynicism, too much despair, too much loneliness. And so we are actually talking ourselves down while young people in East and West Africa are talking themselves up. They only see the upside. And that is fun to be around. It's wonderful to invest in. But we also have the numbers. And so to your point on innovation, we get to invest in young entrepreneurs who see these enormous problems that are daunting to anybody, but they're not afraid to start where they are with what they have. So you take the issue of, you were talking about the slums, you were probably in Kibera, but near there is a slum called Mukuru. And these 3 young people saw that 1 in 3 human beings on the planet have no access to a toilet. Talk about daunting. Then you go into where you were, right, where there's There's no room for infrastructure, no room for sewage. These are areas that are famous for what's called the flying toilet. It's more dignity and it's safer to defecate inside your house into a polyethylene-based bag or on paper even, and then throw the bag onto the rooftops. They often land in the streets. And so when I used to go there, you'd often wear gumboots because you'd be up in the rainy season, in this muck, during the season. They started with this idea that if we built toilets, not in the old-fashioned way of a latrine that gets full and then disgusting, and then nobody wants to use it because you don't know what to do with it. Instead, they built toilets that were dry, 2 holes to separate the liquid and the solid. And every day, the waste is picked up by now about 800 collectors. They bring it to a composting area. The next business that they thought as a way to generate enough revenue to make this business work was to sell fertilizer. And what they learned was that there wasn't really a great market for smallholders to buy natural organic fertilizer. They still sell it, but undaunted, then they started thinking about, well, what are the other products that can be developed? Well, if you breed black soldier flies on top of the compost, you have the ability then to create some of the most protein-rich and energy-efficient animal feed in the world. And so now they've got they essentially have 3 companies. They have a waste collection company. They collect about 200 tons every week of waste, a fertilizer business, and an animal feed business. They run 7,000 toilets across Nairobi and now another city, Kisumu, and they've just expanded into Zambia. That kind of innovation is really exciting to be around. It doesn't provide the kind of venture returns that some of the guys you were talking about are looking for. But if you're looking for investment as a means to fully outsized impact to help us solve our most pressing human problems, I don't think there's a better return on your dollar.
Yeah. And the other term that you pioneered, at least for me, was the idea of social return on investment. That really struck me because I, like you, was born into a prominent family with very much where much is given, much is required. And it just, as I was looking at sort of philanthropic things to get involved in, the reason I was so struck by you was because, number one, you weren't an authoritarian, now you're going to do it this way. There was so much of that, and I'm so repelled by that because it's just not, it doesn't work at all. What I loved about your approach is it's almost like you truly understand complex adaptive systems, and it comes from below where all of the great ideas and emergence come from. And also, though, the idea of give a person a fish, you fed them for the day, teach them how to fish, invest in their fishing pole company, and you might give them a really, really great opportunity that just expands. You plant the seed. And as far as your comment about we here in the West, I agree with you, sadly. And one of my little things I do is I put up 2 quotes from various authors every day on social media. And one that I just recently put up was, and I'm going to mangle it, but it was along the lines of, if you want to destroy a country, poison their stories. People with poisoned stories, they tell defeatist stories. They tell cynical stories. They tell stories of, that's never, ever going to work. And your focus on people, networks, and empowerment, I just think that's planting a seed that literally it just continues to grow, and grow. And that's where the patience comes in. But you also pioneered a lot of things like microfinance, for example. Talk a little bit about that, because I was also struck by that idea, like, Why weren't we doing that before? Why did it take Jacqueline and Acumen to really figure that out and help it scale? That's the important aspect of that.
Well, you said so many things that I actually didn't grow up in a prestigious family. I actually grew up in a scrappy immigrant military family, and I think that was part of my own entrepreneurial bent. All 7 of us are entrepreneurs, and so freedom probably was a core value, Jim. None of us are very good with rules, but all of us feel a deep commitment to each other and to doing what we can to society. And I think it's very much linked to immigrant grandparents who were poor. And I tell you, I see my grandmother's face everywhere and the dignity with which she carried herself, the way she thought about work and the way she thought about community. When I first moved to Rwanda in 1986, microfinance had already been pioneered, but it was very, very nascent. It was 10 years old, but remember that was a time pre-internet, pre-social media, and so you had to really be a junkie about alternative finance if you were going to be at all associated with it. It was in Bangladesh, India, a little bit in Latin America. And I owe a lot to those true pioneers. The idea was that banks had no interest in lending to very, very poor people, just as most companies have very little interest in creating products for low-income people because, well, it's almost tautological. The people have no income. There's very little infrastructure. There's high levels of corruption. There's low levels of trust. To make it work, you have to have very low margins. At least that was the conventional wisdom. When it came to credit, however, poor people, because they couldn't get access to the banks, would go to moneylenders who charge kind of what payday lenders charge now in the United States, right? 400% to 600%. And so if you could provide legitimate, trustworthy credit at 10, 12% per year, which was what we charged at that time in history, there was such a sense of gratitude, capability. The women for the first time were, in a way, it was almost a practicum for working within that formal economy, not just in the informal economy. And so I learned the power of the multiplier effect within an economy by providing these small amounts of loans that women indeed did pay us back, 99, 100%. I also learned that not all human beings are entrepreneurs, and I think it's a mistake we make. We're all survivors, and I think that's why the gig economy has taken off. But the kind of entrepreneur that builds something that creates jobs and disrupts markets, most of us are not wired that way, thankfully. Because I am, and my husband is, and I can tell you what it looks like when the whole community is an entrepreneur. But if we could provide people that access to get credit so that they could solve their own problems, whether it be by a little refrigerator or more tomatoes as working capital, or frankly, have a wedding, which when I first heard of it, I thought, well, that's not productive. But in cultures that are very much dependent on the community helping each other, it could be very productive. And so it helped me understand the economy, I would say, in a much more nuanced, human way than I had previously. So today, microfinance is everywhere. Billions and billions of dollars. It's formalized. There's consumer protection. It's an industry. Patient capital, the work we do, looks more like what microfinance did all those years back. And patient capital is more complex because we invest anywhere from $250,000 to $5 million in a company in the early stages when we believe that it has the potential to help solve one of the big social problems of our time.
You bring up something that has perplexed me for a while in trying to kind of think about how one can go about creating higher trust societies. Um, I think that ultimately, credit comes from the Latin credo, which means I believe. And the idea is, of course, based on trust. I used to tell people, and this is something you'll know because you did work on Wall Street, and a lot of people would look at me like I had three heads when I would say it. But Wall Street is ultimately based on trust. It's based on trust that you will do what, as my counterparty, you will do what you say you will do. Our entire system would disintegrate if all of a sudden none of us trusted our counterparties on Wall Street. And I just wonder, do you have thoughts on how you go about creating and I know, let's not have grandiose ideas. How do you start small other than by showing trust, acting in trust? I know that we can do that as individuals and as organizations with each other and with other people. But then how do you plant that seed in a patient way so that trust that flywheel starts going? Because in higher trust societies, you can just get so much more done.
So, Jim, first I want to challenge Wall Street because I think it used to be very much based on trust. When you look at the financial crisis in 2008, I will never forget being at a dinner where a hedge fund guy was explaining to me that he could lose 90% of his money, of the money people invested, and they'd still be whole. And I was like, help me understand this. How does this work? And he said, well, we're essentially the fourth in line on this market for the mortgage. And I said, but so who ultimately then pays the repo man to take those people's house away from them? And he looked at me, he was like, that's not the question, because that's not my problem. I actually think that what happened on Wall Street in 2008 is that we got so far away from each other that we lost our sense of connection, and that there's trust, to your point, with the people you are dealing with. But I often say that distance dulls the moral imagination. And I actually think that that's happened in many of our financial systems, where we're so far away from the consequences of the financial decisions that we make, including destroying a company because we're not making high enough returns. So just get rid of all the jobs without thinking through the consequences, that it's made us less than we could be. And it's actually reduced trust. Because I 100% agree with you. I think capitalism is built on trust. And I do work in some of the lowest trust pockets of the world. And yet, when you show up and when you consistently make good on your word, it's amazing how people will afford you that trust. So I often say that trust is the rarest currency that we have. It's really easy to lose. It's hard to build. You were brilliant before when you said, you were talking about nations and that the myths, the stories we tell. If those get poisoned, we get poisoned. I think the world needs more role models and business models to show people who they could be and how they could be in the world. And that goes for all of us, to be more conscious about how we lead and know that people are looking at us. But within our companies, some of the best companies in terms of trust building that are purpose-driven, when I think about them, they're great storytellers, and they're great at setting examples and making examples of people. So you mentioned the ambulance company before, which started out with 9 ambulances. When we exited, they had, was it 13,000 ambulances, and they've taken 50 million people to hospital, and they fundamentally helped shape the policies for emergency healthcare in India. the way the ambulance system operated pre-Zikitsa was you would essentially, the way that it did in the United States, you would call in the 50s, you would call the ambulance service, it would never come. And so 90% of people who were in the official ambulances were dead. You would really call them only to take your loved one to the morgue. If you wanted to get somebody in a rush to the hospital, you called the guy with the car or a taxi. And typically you'd pay a bribe to get them there fast. When Zikitsa saw this and saw that this multi-billion-dollar industry was so broken, even though they only had 9 ambulances, they decided to take a run at it. And after they had developed their systems and their operations, they knew that they had to count on the driver's trustworthiness because people were in the habit of paying bribes. So how do you break that? And so there's the according of trust. There's the trust but verify. So they have a call center and they will call many of the people after they'd been to the hospital to make sure, did you pay a bribe? Were you asked to pay a bribe? What was your experience? So you have the checks. And then there was the storytelling. One of my favorite stories was of a ambulance driver who came to the scene of an accident, and the person who'd been hit by a car was lying on the road, and his wallet with about $200 worth of rupees had fallen onto the roadside. And so the driver grabbed the wallet and he would not let it go. He stayed with the patient through surgery because he wouldn't even give it to the doctors. He was so afraid that somebody would steal this money that belonged to the person who had been injured. And when Zikitsa heard that story, they made a hero of this guy. An otherwise sort of nameless man making a few dollars a day got into the newspapers, celebrated inside the company, and suddenly you have a new currency for what does it mean to succeed. I think we have to do that more. We started something at Acumen, which we should bring back. We haven't done it because we're too big now. But we used to do these frontline awards where we weren't just celebrating the entrepreneurs, but the entrepreneurs got the chance to celebrate their most effective employees, the frontline workers. And to see these people go on stages and to be honored for their values, honored for the way they showed up, honored for the excellence with which they did their job was everything. I think we need more of that, not just in companies that are serving the poor, but frankly, in all of our organizations.
I think that's a great idea. And, incentives, I've always been fascinated by incentives. And sometimes some of the best incentives are not financial. Of course, financial incentives matter. But what you're just mentioning and speaking to, recognition, and things like that, they can also build mimetically, right? Like people see that and they're like, wow, I want to be more like that. I want to behave more like that. On your observation about Wall Street, you are correct about the impact of the financial crisis. I was very distressed by the socialization of losses because that sort of goes against everything, at least I'm in favor of, in terms of free markets. It's one of the reasons why I put my name on my companies, because when you put your name on your company, you're all in. Because if you screw up or you do things that are nefarious and bad, it's not global evil corp. It's you. It's O'Shaughnessy, and that's why they used to. The banks used to be Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, Merrill Lynch, Fierce, Penner and Smith. All of it were the names. And they were partnerships, and it was their money. So there was no socialization of losses. If they made mistakes, they were the ones who paid for it. And that's a really good point that you brought up. Yeah, we need to get back to. I was speaking more in terms of like dealing on a counterparty level, where you have to trust your counterparty. But that point is an excellent point, and it really did distress me. We cannot socialize losses. We cannot make others who have nothing to do with it pay for our mistakes. And that's what happened. And I'm with you, totally opposed to that model of capitalism, because that's crony capitalism. That isn't free markets. I deeply believe in free markets, but with level playing fields and rules where consequences matter to the individual and organized players. So I definitely want to acknowledge that you're absolutely right, and I happen to agree with you on that particular thing.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that very much.
And well, thank you for reminding me. It's and for clarifying. It's so interesting to me that we sometimes get lost. You can never. What's the great line about communication is trying to figure out if it's even taken place, and that's something that you're so good at, and your organization is so good at. Tell me about the motivations for the books. They speak beautifully to your mission, to the mission that you share with others. But again, when I first was reading the one with morality, right? I had one of these, like, oh, morality. That's
high on her horse.
Yeah, no, I didn't think that because I know you, but I thought, like when people see that word, I don't think that they mean what you mean. So if you'd help our listeners and viewers talk a little bit about why you chose that particular word and the way you mean morality when you're speaking about it.
Such a great question. And I could talk for a long time even about the titles. Before I do, I want to acknowledge you, though, because you said sometimes with communication, do we even have that communication? And the counter side of that is anybody listening? You are an extraordinary listener. And we'll often say at Acumen that the way we have to teach ourselves to listen is not to come from a place of trying to convert or convince, but to change. And in the interaction we just had, the way you listen, one, really honors the person being listened to. But the way you acknowledge, the way you learned, it just made me feel bigger. And so I just want to acknowledge we need more of that. So thank you.
That's very kind.
It's true. In terms of the reason for the books, the first book actually started out as a love letter to the women with whom I had gone through the genocide in Rwanda. And I want to be clear, I wasn't in Rwanda during the genocide, but I had, over the the years that I was there, that's all I did. This is what I had loved. I put my whole heart and soul into this institution with my co-founders. And I saw communities and I dare say the country in a moment of great change. And to be part of that was incredible. So when the genocide happened and I lost scores and scores of friends, I had to go back to find out what happened to people, and particularly the people that ended up as bystanders or as perpetrators. How? And while I was there, on one of my visits, and I went regularly for years, I found myself needing to discover this bakery that I had started before. We talked about most people aren't entrepreneurs. And I was like, someone's got to build a business. And I couldn't find someone to do it. So I thought, I'll do it. And so I had helped build this bakery, 20 women. And I wanted to go back and see where it was. I knew that the bakery itself wasn't there anymore, but I wanted to see who was there. What did it look like? And I was walking on the street in this little area called Nyamirambo, and all I could find was this blue paint on the road, which was reminiscent of a wonderful day we'd had together where we painted the bakery. And so I knocked on the door I was standing in front of the door. I knocked on the door and a woman came and answered it. And she didn't speak French, which was the language of Rwanda when I lived there. And she had never heard of the bakery. She didn't know anybody who'd lived on that street. She was a refugee who had come from Uganda and taken over the empty house. And in that moment, I suddenly understood what the Jews speak about when they say that those who hold the story have a responsibility to tell them. And that I was a very unlikely person to tell the story of these 20 unwed mothers at this little bakery in Nyamirambo, Rwanda. But I was the one who was left. And that I therefore had a responsibility to tell their story and to tell the story of Diterembere, which was the name of our bank, and the people who had fundamentally changed my life. And so I actually wrote a book that was largely about genocide and the aftermath and what does it mean to be human and how we carry angels and monsters inside of us. But as I was writing it, I was also starting Acumen. And so these two stories started to converge. And it was my husband actually who said, Jacqueline, you're trying to build an enterprise that is disrupting philanthropy and I dare say the conventionalities of the conventions of capitalism. So you're going to confuse the world coming out with a genocide book at the same time. Why don't you use it as part of the trajectory that landed you with these ideas of patient capital and how we might do better at solving our problems of poverty and building a world of dignity? And at first I was resistant, but I found it was ended up being very cathartic because it helped me actually make sense of the different steps that got me to this whole philosophy. And so that was the blue sweater. And then, I don't know, 6-7 years, Jim, and it was actually my board who came to me and said, we think you should write another book because Acumen has done so much now. Some of our companies were reaching 100 million people. And what have you learned? And so I started scratching my head thinking I was going to talk about how patient capital worked and the fundamentals of how you do this kind of investing. And what I realized was that, again, somewhat reticently, but what I realized is that I could write about all those technicalities. But if you really wanted to invest in change, then you had to find those people who made manifest character. And that ultimately our tagline should be, we're Acumen and we invest in character. And so what was the character and what were the tools that were actually required to build solutions to poverty? And here's where the word moral comes in. Because I had to think about the moral imperative in this interdependent world where our action and our inaction every day impacts people around the world is a different moral imperative than the one you and I grew up with, where we only knew the people around us, and then we could do good for the people that we didn't know. Now, people everywhere are connected to each other. So what is that framework? How could I articulate that framework decidedly not as a top-down, I hand you the book set of moral rules, but rather as a bottom-up philosophy grounded in our interdependence, not only on each other as human beings, but to all living things. That's going to require us to use the tools of capitalism and recognize what else is needed so that we build a world where it does work, but it works for all of us. That was the moral imperative, but it's super uncomfortable. And in this time where we see growing, I dare say, moral righteousness, the definition that we have here at Acumen for moral leadership is even more uncomfortable because I see so often on social media a desire to be affirmed in what you know is right. And that is the righteousness piece, rather than to hold a sense of humility in this time of great uncertainty, that we've got to find that space between right and wrong, right doing and wrong doing. We've got to acknowledge truths that each other bring to the table, even when we disagree or we are not going to solve our problems. And it doesn't matter if you are trying to build a business or you are trying to build a community or a school. This is a set of skills and tools that I didn't learn in business school, but we should be teaching in all of our schools. And that became the blueprint, if you will, for a book that might have been better titled The World is Waiting for You, or So You Want to Change the World, because what the book is really about are those practices, the hard and gritty and in the gray realities of what it actually takes to build systems, businesses, organizations that put our humanity and the earth at the center, not just profit.
What a lovely summation. And I love that ultimately what you're saying is morality is really about focusing, and I'm using your words here, on elevating our individual and collective dignity. And when I was reading that, that really rang true for me. I really loved that definition because I, like you, and I try to check myself whenever I'm getting like worked up, but the whole righteousness, that really turns me off. No matter what side you're being righteous about, that isn't the way to elevate individual and collective dignity. Because that's I'm right, you're wrong. That's a binary, deterministic way of looking at the world. And that isn't the way the world works. And
well, I think I've gotten more nuanced in that. I think that having activists who have that moral indignation and righteousness actually are useful for us. But those aren't the people who build solutions.
Right.
And what I am is a person who wants to build. And what Acumen does is find those people who are willing to hold these opposing values, hold these opposing truths. I'm glad that there are people out there saying like this, we're not doing it anymore. Without them, climate change, we'd still all be debating and debating. I mean, we still are technically, but less and less, right? You had those people at the beginning. AIDS, we needed them. But the people who come to the table with solutions, that's the people that I know how to hang with and build with. And I think we need more of them. And I particularly think we need more of them today.
I think that's a wonderful distinction. I've never thought about it that way. You really probably do need those agitators, those people who are just on fire. But it's because I, like you, and I'm built to help solve problems. I'm built to like fix things or come up with and put people together who can build and create and do all of that. But I always miss that part. So thank you. That's like a really good thing for me.
Jim.
Nonsense. That would be impossible. That would be absolutely impossible. But that is such a great distinction in my mind, because you really do need both, right? Even if you're thinking just like a business person, what do you need to think about? You need to think about pain points. You need to think about where is there some sort of glaring problem, and do you have a way that can fix that problem, right? But now my mind is spinning because I'm just kind of thinking of all the times like good ideas that we decided to do something in business about. It was because somebody was squawking.
Right.
They were like, this is wrong. This is like, and in fact, when we started the new company, O'Shaughnessy Ventures, we have a lot of different verticals, but we will only invest in win-win outcomes. And like you mentioned earlier in our conversation, payday loans. I think they are immoral. I think that they are predatory. I think that they are taking advantage of the most vulnerable people. And so, yeah, did we see a bunch of deal flow where you could earn huge sums of money? Yeah, but I won't touch it because like that's not a zero sum game. That's a negative sum game.
Certainly not dignity.
Exactly.
And
I
so,
mean,
Jim,
oh my God.
win-win. How do you define it?
I define win-win as an enterprise or an activity or a new idea or a new company where the transactions occur in such a manner that I am selling whatever I'm selling, my widget, at a price whereby the person who's buying my widget is going to be happy and willing to pay that price because they perceive that the value that they will derive from it is far exceeding the price at which I'm selling it to them. I can win because if I have enough people buying my widgets, I have a profitable company, I can employ people, my employees can win because they have good jobs that they like, but our customers can also win because it's priced at a point where they find much more value than they have to expend. Yeah, but I would also say that win-win mentality is we for so long of our human history, like things really, Hobbes hit it on the head. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, and it doesn't have to be like that anymore. And we now live in a world of almost a magical world of wonders where we have this incredible technology, where we are building the human colossus, where we really can be aware and interconnected with people everywhere. You know, it's often really hard to change your physical zip code, but it's really easy to change your digital zip code. And, like when we started the fellowships, one of the things that was animating me was historically, a genius could be born, lived, and died, and she or he didn't even know that they had anything to contribute, and nobody knew of their ideas or their efforts. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world where we can find and fund those geniuses. And I feel, and here we're going to go. Now I'm going to start using moral. People are going to go, Jim, what the hell are you talking about? But we have sort of the moral obligation to do that, right? Because we are, it may be a chaotic time, but it's also an amazing time because we now have the potential, at least, to build this human colossus. And I think that that's the way we evolved. We evolved to work together. We did not evolve to I'm going to win, you're going to lose. And that's the way a lot of society had to be, or not had to be, but was run. But we don't have to run it that way anymore. And that's one of the things that I just love about Acumen and all the work that you do.
Well, thank you. And no, it really helps me. I like how you are talking about it and you're a problem solver. And so you can see why the work of using the tools of business to solve problems of poverty is so, it's not for what in years of my generation was called the category of the do-gooders.
Right.
It's for the people who fancy themselves, so smart, so determined, so agile that they are going to take the best of themselves to actually build companies in places where they shouldn't work. And that can be a lifelong passion because it's like you get a PhD almost every 6 months, and it's following people who are going into impossible situations and partnering with them to make them not just possible, but thrive. And in one of your podcasts, you talked about, you didn't use the language of the adjacent possible, but you talked about how you love connecting dots because, you love poetry, I love poetry, and how it'll take you to another thing. And I was thinking the adjacent possible because we get to see the adjacent possible unfold. The story that I love the most is in off-grid electricity. And again, in this world of so much cynicism, where to your point, words like moral, words like virtue, words like dignity almost make us embarrassed. And yet, I think we need a little bit more of all of it. Not in a righteous way, but in a way that fundamentally sees the beauty in all of us, the potential in all of us. And so, and the joy of doing this work. And so 2007, there were 1.5 billion people on the planet with no electricity. Two guys who were literally co-eds from business school came to us with a prototype for a $30 solar light. Frankly, they sort of were basing it on a wish and a prayer and a good technology, and we were basing it on a wish and a prayer and some patient capital. But they were the right guys, Necip Tozen and Sam Goldman. And I would say it took them 7 years through that, what we call the wandering through the desert period, where they had to understand how much would a low-income person pay for solar? How long would it take them, to use your word, to trust you that they're not going to buy this technology and a month later it's dead? They couldn't afford it. And how do you finance it? How do you break the kerosene mafias that have no interest in seeing a new technology come into areas that have been dominated by this 19th century source of energy, kerosene? And it was fascinating. Our learning curve was through the roof. Our partners who had given us philanthropy were sometimes impatient. Well, you keep telling me about these failures, Jacqueline, but tell me about the impact. They were getting impact all along the way. But in 2011, you have an adjacency in that cell phone banking is now letting you pay for your electricity every day. You don't need any other kind of financing. If you can't pay that day, you could even turn your unit off. But otherwise, you pay, and as long as you keep paying, they keep your unit on. Other companies start building. Today, we have 40 companies in which we're investing. They have brought almost 250 million people light and electricity, not as charity, because they value it. They can afford it now. But so there's still 800 million people with no access to electricity. About 220 million of those people will not be reached by the markets that have been built. They're just too poor. And we haven't figured out yet how to make this affordable. And unlike other markets where you can increase the price, you're already at a price that are putting people under. They're not getting enough to eat. And yet this could fundamentally change their trajectory into the beautiful world you're talking about, because I share your belief that this is for all of us. And so that's when the fun begins. We're now have a $250 million facility where we're unapologetic about the grants that we need to help create markets that didn't exist, concessionary debt, different kinds of incentives, the side-by-side assistance. That's not charity. That's market building. It requires different kinds of capital. It only functions when you find the right character in terms of the entrepreneurs in whom you're investing, but also your own character. Are you trustworthy? Do you bring what you can? Do you give more than you take? Whether you're the investor or the entrepreneur or the government partner, we start moving from that place, which I also dare say has a moral basis to it in the way that our moms and dads may have thought about it. We can do this. There's no reason we still have 800 million people on the planet without access to electricity. In fact, that is not only immoral, but it's dangerous, and it's incredibly unproductive. And so that's what excites me, that you can start with, it's a journey, 17 years, but you can start with the $30 light in 2007, and in 2024, have a sight line through some of the toughest economies on the African continent, but where people are just as hungry and ambitious and driven as anywhere else and as talented. They just haven't had the education or the access or the money to help them get there. It doesn't take that much. By our calculation, call it $1 per household that requires subsidy to get electricity by using the private sector in ways that allow poor people to flourish.
It's such a wonderful synchronicity, because when I was in Bhutan, we were visiting a lot of villages that had no electricity. And my wife and I were wandering down a very, if you've ever been there, you know that the roads are
so beautiful.
So we were walking down very carefully because it was getting dark, a road to a small village near the hotel that we were staying. And there were all sorts of those lamps in that village. And so I'm very curious. And so one of the things that was great is when the children see you coming, they're so welcoming, and they come with these beaming faces, and they grab your hand and they want to show you everything. And it's just so delightful. But I got into a lovely discussion with their father and mother about the lighting. And I'm sure it wasn't the same company that you're talking about, but it was exactly, it could in fact be, because they were so proud of the fact that because they had more than one, the entire area where they lived was lit up with these lamps. And they told the story with such great pride that they had solved this problem. And then, it was kind of, the child was speaking English. The parents didn't speak English. Right. And so there was a translation lag. But I could just tell when the mother was gesturing to the parts of the village that were dark, and then the child was translating, Mommy and Daddy want to make sure that next time you come, everything will be lit up. And see, that's magical to me, because that is, as you say, it's a market. Markets don't have to be all about hard noses and, green eye shades. That was a market solution that worked. That couple that I had the privilege of talking with, they were hell-bent that the entire place next time I stopped in the village was going to be lit up.
So, Jim, I have a story for you, but also just to bring that point home, Bhutan is an energy exporter, right? It produces more energy than it needs as a country, and yet if you're poor, you don't have access, or if you do have access, the electricity that comes to you because of these hills, the mudslides, the rural areas, you might get it a couple of hours a day. And so it is not at all unusual for us to be in villages where the grid is overhead, but the reliability is in the systems that these families make the decision to buy. The story I want to tell, because when people see it, it's magic. And the other part of the adjacent possible is you get people access to electricity, and the next thing that comes is solar television. Those solar televisions are now, we have an education company, every day it's reaching 13 million kids, and their scores are jumping through, it's called the Kili networks, because they have solar television. Then you can have a distribution system for cook stoves, which is the largest contributor to deforestation on the African continent. Suddenly that adjacent possible allows you to build on other innovation for people. But the story is, D-Light is the name of the company. And I was actually in Rajasthan in India, and in a place where the grid was overhead, but all the homes had solar home systems. And I was sitting with a group of women, and I was asking them why they still chose to use the solar and what gave them the courage to put away their kerosene lantern, because it's a big deal to take a risk like that when you have no money. And they gave me lots of reasons that people give, like you can carry it to the bathroom at night, and so you're safer. It helps you see snakes, so you can not be so afraid. You don't have, a woman said, I don't feel stress because when I had the kerosene lantern, I was always worried it would fall over and hurt my children or do something worse. And now I don't feel stress. And I said, that's really interesting, man, because the young man who founded this company was actually living in a West African village when his neighbor's kerosene lantern fell over and it burned down the house and it almost killed his eldest son. And it was in that moment that he decided he was going to commit his life to eradicating kerosene. And now I'm sitting in front of you and you're using one of his lights. And she leaned forward, tears in her eyes, and she said, please, madam, would you thank that young man for me? And Jim, this is what we've got to communicate, I think, to young people who want to be of use, that we are too wedded to this concept of success based on money, power, and fame. If instead we thought about the amount of human energy that we could release in the world as our number one metric, and one day someone on the other side of the world might say, just thank you. And I think that we need to tell more of those stories. And we certainly need more of those entrepreneurs.
What a lovely story. And it just, we've seen that happen so often as well. And, we're also pretty big investors in AI, artificial intelligence. And one of the questions, I actually put it up on Twitter. What if we maximize the objective function for creativity as opposed to revenue? What if we maximize the objective function for all of the things that we're talking about here today? And I love this adjacent possible, because I'm going to steal that from you, Jacqueline.
But speaking of Steve Johnson, who first said it, Steven Johnson, who's such a brilliant writer.
Yeah, I'm. That's funny. I've read a lot of him, and I don't equate that term with him. I must have been slow that particular day, but I love it. Then I'm going to steal it.
I steal it. Because I think once you see it, you start to see the building blocks. And there's nothing like off-grid energy to create an economy. But you have to build, you have to take the first step.
Exactly. But what I love about the term is it itself opens up the adjacent possible, right? Because of the way you tell the story beautifully. Hey, you get the electric, then you get a solar TV, then you get a solar iPad, then you get, and fill in the blank. It just continues to grow. Stability AI, which is a company I've invested in, got the remit to educate some of the school children in Malawi. And we're using solar-powered tablets. And every time I see an update on it, it just makes me feel so good, because, these kids, you'll see videos and the faces are just filled with pure joy and
curiosity.
Exactly. And the more that we can do to nurture curiosity, to help along those lines, and I love it that tell that young man thank you. What a wonderful, wonderful story. Well, we are closing in on our time. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. What are you most excited about right now with your endeavors and all the great things that you're working on?
In a way, it goes to what you were saying. When you were asking me before, how do you convince people that it's great to invest in places like the African continent or Pakistan, that I used to talk to people from a place of the promises of what could be. Now I get to say, look at what has been done. And we have a new generation, and it's time to build on it. So what excites me most right now would number one be this work with bringing electricity to the people who are considered the hardest to reach on the planet, in countries like Somalia, Burkina Faso, the Congo, Malawi, Zambia, etc., to give people who are fundamentally left out of opportunity that first rung. It's going to be really, really difficult. And I'm in that camp of people who do things because they're difficult. And so I'm very, very excited by that. The second thing that really excites me is Acumen Academy, where we are really focused on building one of the world's real schools for social change, trying to offer these tools of business, but they're grounded in the moral imagination. How do you build in ways that put our humanity and the earth at the center? And how do we then take these ideas and send them off into the world? And the third is just Acumen as a constellation, if you will. In the next 3 years, in the for-profit side of the house, we'll have raised and will be deploying almost $1 billion across Latin America, East, West Africa, India, Pakistan, and the United States. We have Acumen US America now, doing really amazing things. The lessons from all of this, particularly at this nexus of poverty and climate, I believe we have a lot to offer the world. And so thinking about how do you influence, how do you talk, how do you bring others in? Because we have the skills and the knowledge and the technologies, and goodness knows with AI, we're going to have that in abundance. How do we alight our moral imagination? How do we reinforce our will to continue to do the hard things, not for ourselves, but for other people? Because as you said before, we don't really get dignity until everyone has dignity.
I love that. You know, O'Shaughnessy Ventures has a film division. And as you were speaking about what's exciting you, I just immediately saw a documentary. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I might come later and say, would you be willing to let us make a documentary about this? Because I think that would be such a great film to make.
Jim, I think it's a really important film because we have these hidden heroes across the world. And
I think you just named the documentary. Hidden Heroes. Oh my God, I love that.
And we've got hundreds of them, and they blow my mind. And it's, I mean, just a few like headlines, like the guy who saw the flowers in the rivers in India and realizes that they're covered in arsenic and lead and cadmium. So he realizes that these have been given to the temples as blessings, and the temple priests throw them in the river, and then they pollute the rivers and people that are bathing. So he builds a business where he collects the flowers, hires women from the lowest caste. They convert them into incense sticks and now vegan leather. And he just got a contract with Tommy Hilfiger. Like, these are the kinds of innovations started by people who follow the thread of their curiosity and bring hardcore business skills to bear in ways that help people solve their problems, create jobs, create opportunity, do so in a way that can help us solve our problems. And so Hidden Heroes, I'm in.
Oh, I love it. Okay, I'm in too then. So that we'll have to have a meeting
lunch,
just about.
Jim.
Yes, perfect. Let's do that. Well, Jacqueline, how can people listening or watching, if they want to get involved, where can they go to find out more about you, the Acumen Fund, et cetera?
They could go to our website at Acumen, ACUMEN.org. It's probably the very best way to start to learn about us. And then that will lead you to, I want to learn about Acumen India, Pakistan, Acumen America, Acumen Academy. We've got a growing number of resources and courses on acumenacademy.org, which allows people who are interested in building their solutions not only to build, but hopefully as we ourselves build, find each other.
I think that's great. And I'm so impressed by both you and the organization and everything you've done. You are a shining example. And the world is a vastly better place because you're in it. if you've listened, you know that our final question is going to create you the Empress of the world. You can't put anyone to death. You can't re-educate anyone in a camp. But what you can do is we're going to give you a magical microphone and you can speak into it 2 things. And everyone on the planet, whenever their morning is going to wake up and look at themselves or their loved one and say, I have just had the 2 greatest ideas. And what's different this time is I'm going to act on both of them. What 2 ideas are you going to incept in the world's population?
So the first one, it would have been the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's dignity, but you already took it. So first one is just...
I stole it from you.
Well, still. The first one is just start. That too many people sit at the starting blocks wondering what their purpose is, waiting to do something. And I've learned that purpose doesn't come to people waiting on the sidelines. We find our purpose by following the thread of our curiosity. We take a step toward it. Whether we fall down or learn, we're going to know a lot more after we've taken that step. It leads us to the next step. And before you know it, you've lit the world. So just start. And the second one, which goes to these times, and you and I talked about it, but that building anything is hard. Building things in an interdependent world, particularly for people who have been overlooked and underestimated, can sometimes feel impossible. It requires not righteousness and not a full level of certainty, but a willingness to hold opposing values in tension. One of my favorite quotes is by a Sufi, by Rumi, who says, beyond wrongdoing and right doing is a field. I'll meet you there. So just start and move into this world with all the audacity that it takes to believe that you can change the world and the humility that is willing to look around and recognize what we're facing in the world. And you hold those 2 things in tension and you're willing to do the work, you can make magic happen.
I love both of those, Jacqueline, and I will meet you there.
I will meet you there, Jim.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.